The topic today is going to be efficiency. And I think it's a very deeply misunderstood topic. People think about bean counters and people who don't know the value. They know the price of everything but the value of nothing. Efficiency is, on the contrary, an incredibly important concept. If you haven't noticed already, you'll come to notice, and I'm going to tell you explicitly today, I am what I choose to call an efficiency radical. If you're not doing it efficiently, you're doing it wrong. Economically wrong and morally wrong. Efficiency doesn't mean good. It's not the same as good. There are many allocations that are efficient from an economic perspective that are horrible. An efficient allocation just means one that makes the most use of the available resources. There are many efficient allocations, by which I mean allocations that we can't change without making someone worse off than before. There are many such allocations that are horrible. There might be one guy with all the money and everybody else starving in a ditch, and yet that could be an efficient allocation. But we would say, most of us, especially the people who are starving in a ditch, would say that's a bad allocation compared to the one where the guy who has all the money has a little bit less and we have something to eat. So good doesn't mean the same thing as efficient. What it does mean is that if you're not efficient, you can move to a new situation that is efficient and in the process make everyone better off. Look at this finely etched diagram. This is a diagram I made from one of my early Macs. It was a really well-drawn diagram when I made it. The school then, we had a bozo IT director who said, henceforth the school will not allow people to use Macs. You have to use Windows machines. And so reluctantly, those of us who used Macs switched to Windows machines, whose architects saw to it that the graphics designs we had done on other programs translated into the new environment roughly like this. The old IT guy left. The people who cared about quality went back to Macs in a hurry. No offense to the Windows people. I know it's a matter of opinion. There's reasons to choose different platforms for different. We went back to Macs, but I kept that diagram just as a remembrance of that era. I didn't want to forget that the school had gone through that. I wanted to be on guard against the school ever going down a path like that. I wanted to resist more strongly than I'd managed to do the last time. Anyway, you still get the idea of the diagram. What it means is we use a pie to indicate the total amount of economic surplus available to distribute among the relevant parties. The slices indicate each party's individual share of that pie. Here, in this simple instance, there are only two people, a rich guy and a poor guy. R is the rich guy, P is the poor guy. And here's the claim. If you make the pie bigger, it's got to be possible for everybody to get a bigger slice than before. Does anybody question that claim that I just made? It's just a consequence of simple geometry. Keep the angle of the slices the same and make the diameter of the pie bigger. Every slice gets bigger than before by exactly the same proportion. This is an efficient situation. By comparison, this situation is inefficient. Inefficient, therefore, is bad. Bad in every intuitive sense of the word. Why would anyone prefer this situation to this situation? Maybe you erroneously think that this situation corresponds to a high growth economy that's polluted and stressed and tense and horrible to live in. This is a bucolic, poor, rural environment where everybody is focused on what really counts in life. That's not what the diagrams mean. Everything that matters to people is accounted for in the diameter of the respective pies. You don't like pollution, that's a negative. That makes the pie smaller. How much would you be willing to pay to reduce pollution from where it is? That negative valuation is part of the accounting that determined the diameter of the pie to begin with. So you can't say we're ignoring things that matter. Everything that matters in principle is in that accounting. And so if you say you can move from one pie to a bigger pie, that's got to be a good thing to do. There are people who want to pursue their life's goals who don't have enough resources to do them. If you could give them more resources to pursue their life goals, as long as they weren't harming anyone else, why wouldn't you want to do that? That would be a good thing. So if inefficiency is economically wrong and it's morally wrong, what's the right thing to do? A necessary condition for being the right thing to do, economically or morally, is that it be efficient. That's not a sufficient condition for it being the right thing to do. I talked right out off the bat about cases where the allocations were so skewed that nobody would call them good, much less morally admirable. But if you're not efficient, you can do better for everybody. And why wouldn't you want to do that? That's the issue. I'm going to take you through examples whose aim is to hit you over the head repeatedly with that same point. I'm not deliberately trying to bore you by hitting you over the head repeatedly with the same point. It's just that that's the way the brain rewires to accept new information in a way that is accessible to you when you go outside. If we're going to use resources efficiently, the price people pay should be equal to the marginal cost of what they're using. Marginal cost in the fullest sense. All relevant costs that are associated with the use of an extra unit should be in the price that confronts the person deciding how many units of it to use. If we don't have a price equal to marginal cost, people are going to use resources inefficiently. They'll either use too many of them or too few of them, depending upon whether price is greater or less than marginal cost. If you're using resources inefficiently, that's exactly equivalent to saying it's possible to rearrange how we're doing things in a way that would make some people better off without hurting anybody else. Why wouldn't we want to do that? If you have an argument about why we shouldn't do that, send it to me. I'll read it with interest. I've never seen that argument laid out in any convincing form. Because I don't think it's possible to argue cogently in favor of that claim. Efficiency is a necessary condition for saying we're doing things right. It's not sufficient, it's necessary. There are lots of efficient allocations that we don't like and have good reason not to like. But if an allocation is not efficient, it can't be that we're doing the best we can. I was once the chief economist at the Civil Aeronautics Board, the federal agency that used to regulate the airlines. At that time, the status quo was if an airline overbooked, it was first come, first served. If too many people showed up, the first ones to show up got the seats. The ones who came later didn't get to go. So here's an example based on that system. So we've got 60 people showing up for a flight that can accommodate only 250. The reason airlines do that is not because they're evil. It's because people often don't show up, and if they didn't overbook, their flights would leave with many empty seats, and they would have to charge higher fares to cover their costs. That would be bad for you. So the fact that they overbooked by itself is not a bad thing. That is, on average, a good thing for consumers in the long run, because it enables them to get where they're going for lower average fares. I want to focus on two particular passengers out of the 260 who showed up. John was the second one. He's an office custodian. He's on his way to visit his seriously ill mother in Los Angeles. He'd be willing to pay $200 to avoid missing the flight. It'll take him 10 hours to get there if he has to wait for the next available flight. He doesn't want to do that. He's afraid he'll miss seeing his mother. Maybe she'll die in the intervening 10 hours. It's important to him. Is $200 a lot of money? For him, it's a quite princely sum to offer to avoid missing his seat. That's what he would be willing to pay. The other passenger I'll focus on is, I'm going to call him Eric. He got there 255th in the line. He got there 255th, not because he didn't care if he got a seat, but because his connecting flight didn't get there in time for him to get there any earlier. He's a Microsoft vice president. He's going on vacation to Hawaii. The airline can rebook him on a routing through Seattle, say, that will get him an hour later than he would have gotten there if he'd gone on this flight. But he doesn't want to wait an hour. Most people don't. He'd be willing to pay $1,000 to avoid missing the flight. So the question is, who should miss the flight? Notice that I put should in scare quotes. Who should miss the flight? I tried to cook the example in such a way that if you have a pulse, you ought to have an impulse to say, Eric should miss the flight. But the efficiency criterion seems to say otherwise. That seems like, wow, if he missed the flight, we'd be missing out on $1,000 worth of economic surplus. If John misses the flight, we'd be missing out only on $200. So the economic surplus, the pie, is going to be smaller. If Eric misses the flight, it's going to be smaller by $800. Well, it is true that John should be the one to miss the flight. Why? Because there is an arrangement that we can all agree would be better for everyone that has him missing the flight and Eric continuing to keep his seat as originally scheduled. What we proposed at the CAB, when this was the practice of airlines to bump people on a first come, first serve basis, the people who got there last didn't get to go, that method took no account of how urgent it was for you to keep to your schedule. There might be people who would lose an enormous amount by not getting there on time. Others were just going to sit on a beach. They were reading a detective novel. They'd just be almost as happy to continue reading their detective novel, waiting for the next flight, as they would be to sit in a cab a little earlier and go to their hotel room, get there a few hours earlier and read it there. No big deal. The first come, first served was a terrible method for trying to identify people to bump from them. You want the people who don't need to go to be the ones who wait, the people who need to go to be the ones who keep their seats. What we proposed in place of first come, first served was an auction system, one based on the price mechanism. Airlines would be required in these situations to step up and offer compensation payments for people to volunteer to relinquish their seats. Most of you have been present when such transactions have taken place. They'll keep upping the ante, at least this was the proposal, until they get enough volunteers, and then the flight goes forward as planned. Nobody's required to give up her seat. You know, you want to keep your seat, you can. The situation, as we proposed it, was to transform a situation in which no account was taken of the value of keeping your seat into one in which people took precise account of how much it was worth to people to get to continue on as scheduled. When you propose a change in a federal regulation, you have to publish that proposal in the Federal Register. That's one of the bureaucratic rules. And then people are given 60 days to comment. Interested parties can step forward and comment on this proposal. We published it. We didn't expect to hear any opposition. But what happened was Aviation Consumer Action Project, a consumer group founded by Ralph Nader, immediately filed an angry brief saying, in effect, what he's saying here. This will be yet another domain where people with diminished ability to pay, that is to say, the poor, will get short shrift in life. So it's the poor people who will wait for the next seat. The rich will happily continue on their way. And we don't like that. People on the Civil Aeronautics Board, some of them were persuaded by that argument. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't do this. But on reflection, what a bizarre argument this turns out to be. Will it always be rich people who continue on? Well, let's say this. It'll be mostly people with higher incomes who will choose not to volunteer. It'll be students who volunteer. It'll be poor people who volunteer, more often than not. People with diminished incomes who assign high value to the payment they're being offered and relatively low value to getting there on time. Those people will step forward, but it won't always be them. If you're a rich guy and you're reading your novel and you don't care whether you wait an extra hour or two to go on the next flight, why not get a coupon to go somewhere for free? It won't always be poor people who wait, but grant him his assumption. So what if it were always poor people who chose to wait? It would be poor people who elected to wait, not who were forced to wait. So you can feel some sympathy. Imagine they're about to allocate seats using this auction procedure, and a poor guy, John in my example, has reluctantly decided to step up and say, all right, I'll accept the $400 payment you've offered. I'm going to wait and take a chance, 10 hours. I probably will get to LA in time to visit with my mother, but the money is valuable to me. My daughter needs braces. The kids are calling her Bugs Bunny at school. She's ashamed. She doesn't want to go to school. I can't afford to get her braces. I'm poor. I don't have very much money. Money matters to me. That's why I wasn't willing to offer any more than $200 to keep my seat on the flight. I wish I had more money. Well, they offered $400. I didn't want to wait, but waiting and being paid $400, as I reckoned it, was the better of the options I had at my disposal. Now, here comes, so I'm about to accept the $400 compensation payment. Up runs Ralph Nader waving his injunction, stop the auction. I'm going to protect you. If you're poor, you might say, tell me how that's protecting me. I just volunteered to take a compensation payment of $400 to wait for the next flight. Now you're telling me, no, you can't do that. So I have to go on the flight, which is worth $200 to me. You've just said, give me $200, the difference between the $400 and the $200. That's evil to do that to a person. That's a gratuitous injury that you've inflicted on that person. This is efficiency. It's not bloodless efficiency, it's efficiency. If you're not doing it efficiently, you're doing it wrong. You're missing a chance to make everybody better off. Every example I'm going to talk to you about can be transformed into an example of exactly this form. You start with an inefficient situation. It's always going to be possible to contrive some kind of maneuver that will take you from that situation to an efficient situation and make everybody better off, or at least no one worse off in the process. A country subsidizes coal because it feels bad its citizens are so poor they can't afford to heat their homes adequately in the wintertime. They're chilly. We want to protect them. Let me also state as a qualification that the kind of arguments I'm mounting on behalf of efficiency apply to small bore items in one's lifetime menu of choices. They don't apply to threats to your life with probability 0.8 or anything of the sort. We're talking about things that have a valuation that are a small fraction of your lifetime income. The case for being efficient about such things is compelling. Sometimes the case for being efficient with respect to larger items will be the final word. Sometimes it won't be. I'll try to mention some examples in each category. But the government's concerned about the well-being of citizens. It wants to make coal affordable for them. And so they import coal in the world market. And to keep it affordable, the coal they import at a price of $100 a ton, they sell at a subsidy to citizens for a reduced price of $50 a ton. Will coal use be efficient in this country? No. What's the marginal cost of coal from the perspective of people who live in this country? It's $100. That's how much it costs the country to get an extra ton of coal. What's the price they're going to pay when they use an extra ton of coal? $50. What will they do? They'll keep using coal up until the benefit to them of the last unit they use is only $50. If it were $60, they'd use more coal. And that will mean that some of the coal that they use has benefit less than it costs the country to get the coal. And that's wasteful. So let's go through some examples that get at that. You don't want to encourage people to use coal up until it's worth only $50 to them when it costs the country $100 to get an additional unit of the coal. All right, there is a demand curve for coal in the country. If it were selling at the true marginal cost, people would demand Q million tons a year of it. Instead, we price it at half that. They demand Q primed. Every unit of coal consumed costs the country $100. Only the units consumed up until Q have a value to the citizens of $100 or higher. Once you get past that point, and they will keep consuming all the way out to Q prime, once you get past that point, the ton of coal people use still costs $100, but it's worth less than that to them. Every ton you consume beyond Q is a loss of economic surplus to the country. And that's bad, because that's surplus that you could use to make people better off. It's like flushing the resources down the toilet. Why would you want to do that? Somebody tell me why that would be a good idea to do that. I can't think of a reason. I'm guessing you can't think of a reason either, because there isn't any reason why that would be a good thing to do. Okay. Again, being efficient isn't the same as being good. There are plenty of things that are efficient that are not good. But there are not very many things that are not efficient that you can say are good, because it's always possible to make those things better for everybody. And how can it be good when we're missing an opportunity to make life better for everybody? That can't be good. That's why I'm an efficiency radical. Efficiency is one of the most important things you could possibly attend to, because when you make things more efficient, it's possible to do more of every good thing that you care about. It's important to achieve efficiency. we can believe that efficiency is important and still think it would be a good idea to steer additional resources to people who are down on their luck. Most of the bankruptcies in the United States as of 2010 were from people who got seriously ill and didn't have health insurance. Sometimes it wasn't their fault that they didn't have health insurance. They didn't have a job, which is how most people got their health insurance. They had a pre-existing condition, which meant companies wouldn't be willing to supply them health insurance except at a price no one could afford. And then their condition bit them and they went bankrupt because the care was so expensive. Most countries don't put people through that. There are very few countries like ours where if a kid got cancer, you would see the neighbors organize a bake sale to pay for the kid's treatments. That's not the way they do it in most places. It's not a good way. That's not a good way to do it, in my opinion. Others may feel, well, you need to confront hardship in order to develop character. I mean, there are arguments you hear for that, but mostly people who got sick didn't get sick because they were bad. They got sick just because of circumstance. Okay, but if you try to help the poor by subsidizing the small bore items that they consume, you're not doing as much for them as you can. Why would you want to miss opportunities to do more for people you're trying to help than you could do? So let's put some numbers on this. We've got the demand curve and the prices. Now let that be 80 million tons, let that be 100 million tons. Every ton consumed up to 80 million tons a year is cost justified. People get a benefit from it that's greater than the cost of the country of doing it. Every ton after that is not cost justified. The cost of it is 100. The benefit is whatever's on the demand curve, and that's at every point less than 100. So every unit of coal is going to be wasted surplus beyond 80 million tons a year. Zero waste there, a little bit of waste there, more and more waste. We would add up all the sticks that constitute wasted economic surplus going to the right out to 100 million tons, and we would get that area. That's $500 billion a year in this example. Well, the numbers don't mean anything since I just pulled them out of thin air. But that's $500 million flushed down the toilet. It's resources not available to do real things. It's not paper losses, it's real losses. Why would you want to flush a huge amount of money down the toilet?
What if people die?
What if they die?
Yeah, then would the quantity also go down, the demanded?
Yeah, I tried to preclude that question by saying we're talking only about small bore items. So it's not like if you don't have access to $50 coal, you freeze to death. No, that's not the situation.
That would be the one that would break the...
Yeah. Benjamin.
In this situation, technically, for that small country, they're losing that wealth, but they're actually giving it to the country that's exporting coal, and they're kind of subsidizing the coal industry.
Well, if the marginal cost of coal were constant in the world market at 100, the supplier is just getting compensation for the cost of digging the coal out of the earth. So they're not really creating any huge benefits for the, seller surplus you get when there's an upward sloping supply curve. If there's constant costs, there wouldn't be any area between the price and the supply curve. So yeah, I don't think we want to say failure to do this policy disadvantages coal suppliers. That would depend on the supply curve. And from the perspective of a small country, or any participant, it's a world market where the supplies are pretty much constant at the cost of getting it out. Okay. This is a bad policy because it's so easy to describe a policy that would make everybody better off. Everybody's poor in this country. That's why they did it, because everybody was having a hard time heating their homes to a comfortable level. What's the cost of the subsidy? It's this rectangle. The coal they buy at $100 a ton, they sell each ton at $50. The difference, that's the money that they have to spend subsidizing the coal that's bought in the country. They have to raise that money in tax from the citizens. If they didn't subsidize the coal, they'd be able to give a tax rebate equal to exactly $5 billion. $5 billion. That's 100 million tons a year times $50 a ton. That's how much extra tax they need to collect in order to pay for this subsidy. You multiply those two amounts out and you get $5 billion a year. $1 billion is a lot. Again, you can't take anything from the specific number in the example because it's just a hypothetical number. But what if the government eliminated the subsidy? It would give people a tax cut of exactly $5 billion a year. That's what they had to raise in order to pay for the subsidy. There'd be an upside and a downside for every household. The upside would be you'd get your share of the $5 billion tax cut. So the upside in the aggregate is worth to consumers $5 billion a year. What's the downside? Oh, we can't get cheap coal anymore. How much does that cost us? We can actually put a number on that. Getting cheap coal meant that our consumer surplus from coal was the area of this big triangle, all the way up to the top and then back down. If we have to pay $100 a ton for the coal, our surplus is a smaller triangle. It's the area between 100 up to the top and then back down. The difference is the area of this figure. That's the lost consumer surplus from not being able to buy cheap coal. What's that area? What kind of figure is that? Is it a trapezoid? Is it a trapezoid? It's not a parallelogram. I think it's probably a trapezoid. Is it a? Okay, so what's the formula for the area of a trapezoid? Does anyone remember?
Yeah, the sum of the top and the divided by 2.
So you take the average of these two lengths. So that length plus that length over 2, that's the average length, times the height.
Or just
What if you couldn't remember that?
or just calculate
If you couldn't remember that, you'd say it's that rectangle plus that triangle. That's what I do. I don't care how you do it. It won't take you longer to do it one way than the other, but if I asked you, what's the lost consumer surplus by not being able to buy cheap coal anymore, that would be the answer. It's $4.5 billion a year. So there's an upside to this policy, $4.5 billion. Extra consumer surplus. I like buying cheap coal. That's awesome. What's the downside? The $5 billion in tax I got to pay in order to have that opportunity. And the tax is bigger than the gain because the last 20 million tons a year we're using that we shouldn't be using. We're throwing money into the ocean. Josh.
Sorry, this is just to confirm that everyone equally will be using this subsidy in that country.
I'm assuming for the purposes of this example that everybody is poor and has the same miserable low income as everyone else. So could you answer the question? How much surplus is lost here? You know, give people a tax cut, take away their right to buy cheap coal, and they're going to be $500 million a year better off in the aggregate than they were before. That's a question I might ask you. I'm going to say, based on the experience I've had when I ask questions like that, that question is easy difficult. Lots of people miss it. There's nothing conceptually difficult about it. If you did 4 or 5 questions like this, you would, I hope, most of you internalize the logic of the argument nicely and be able to calculate how much more efficient pricing the resource at marginal cost would be than to give it away at a subsidized price. So why not get those points? You know, the midterm comes along, there's a question like that. and you miss it. What do you say? What do you say? You knew it was coming. You knew it was doable. It wasn't. You didn't have to endure torture to get from not being able to do it to where you could do it. Why didn't you get to where you could do it? But I flag this because from my experience, people get this kind of question incorrect on tests. You shouldn't get it incorrect. If you're not paying marginal cost, you're going to be using the resource inefficiently. That's a simple point. We've got a rental market. If we leave it alone, it'll rent at a rent of $600 per apartment, and there'll be 3,000 units a month rented. If we ask how much surplus the parties in the market will get, it'll be this huge pink area here. The renters will get that surplus, the landlords will get that surplus. If we put a cap on rents, let's say we control rents at 200, there won't be 3,000 apartments rented, there'll be only 1,000. The consumer surplus will be different. It won't be this big triangle. Instead, it's going to start lower. That's the price they pay. The value they get from the apartments is all the way up there at the demand curve. So this area, the area of this trapezoid, might be bigger than that whole area that they were getting of surplus before. If so, renters might like the idea of rent controls. The people who get an apartment will certainly like the idea. The people who don't get one may have different feelings about it. But the landlord surplus, look what happens to it. It was this big triangle. Now it's shrunken down to be that tiny triangle. And if I asked you to compute the loss in total surplus from this arrangement, it would be fairly easy for you to do. It would be this pink area here. That's the loss in surplus. That's money that's like burnt up in a bonfire. Suppose I asked you to figure out a deal that would get everybody to agree to eliminating the rent controls. What would you have to do? You'd have to give a payment to the renters to volunteer to give up the asset that they were benefiting from. Who would pay it? The landlords want you to repeal rent control and be done with it. But you're an elected official, you'd never get away with that. The people who are renting under rent controls would have your scalp if you did that. So you can credibly say to the landlord, yeah, I'm sympathetic to your position, and I'd like to repeal the rent controls, but I'd be voted out of office if I did that. So you're going to have to help me put together a deal that will get people on board with this. So I'm going to say, landlords, give me some money. What if they say no? Then I can say, well, all right, we'll stick with the rent controls. So I've got some leverage over the landlords. Give me some money. What am I going to do with that money? I'm going to give it back to the people who are renting in some form or other. Maybe I'm going to reduce their city taxes in some lump sum way. But if I choose the amounts correctly, I've got a lot to work with. That's all the extra resources that will be saved if we move here rather than here. So if you can't figure out a way to make a deal that makes everybody happier than he or she is now, then you're not thinking about it. There's always a deal. It's your bad leadership, your lack of creativity that's kept you stuck in a bad position. Ben?
Do you mind re-highlighting which area is the surplus in the $200 rent exam?
This is the landlord surplus. It's the difference between what they get, that's the amount they charge, that's the amount they would have been willing to sell the apartment for. The consumer surplus is the difference between what they would have been willing to pay, it's the part of the demand curve that's truncated up there, and what they actually do pay, the rent. So
It would go up to the y-axis.
yeah, it would go up to the demand curve. It would be that trapezoid or whatever it is.
Thank you.
Let's change the context of the example slightly. Hair salons sometimes follow a practice analogous to what airlines do. They overbook. The reason they overbook is that there are a lot of no-shows, and if they didn't overbook, they'd have to charge more for their hair appointments than they do charge. And so that's why the practice survives. But what do they do on those occasions when everybody shows up, when you book 5 appointments for 3 slots? That's what this example is about. Everybody shows up. You book 5 appointments for 3 slots, 6 p.m. Here are the arrivals. There are the times when they arrive, and then I'm giving you some additional information in this column. What's this number mean? That means, quite apart from any surplus that she gets from getting her hair cut, Anne would be willing to pay $6 to avoid having to reschedule. Okay? She'd be willing to reschedule, but how much would it bother her to have to do that? $6 would exactly compensate her for whatever injury she would experience from having to reschedule. Bill, I don't know, maybe he's more sensitive than Anne, maybe he's richer than Anne, for whatever reason, he's willing to pay $11 to avoid having to reschedule. Carrie, only $4. Maybe she just doesn't have anything else to do and doesn't care when she comes, or doesn't care much, or maybe she's poor and couldn't afford to pay much more than $4 to avoid being inconvenienced. Dana's willing to pay $12, Earl's willing to pay $5. If we do first come, first served as a way of allocating the scarce slots, how much surplus will there be? Well, and how much will we lose by that method? The first come, first served method means that the first 3 who come, namely Anne, Bill, and Carrie, will be the ones who get to keep their appointments. And Dana and Earl will be told to come back another time. If we do that, the surplus from getting to keep your appointment will be 6 plus 11 plus 4. That adds up to 21. That's not efficient because we're not having the 3 people keep their slots who care most about it as measured by what they're willing to pay to keep their slots. Again, how much you're willing to pay doesn't measure your psychological distress needle, how much it would move if you miss. It's a combination of how you would feel about missing your slot plus your ability to pay. Those 2 things in tandem govern how much you're actually willing to pay to avoid missing your slot. What we know is that if the 3 people who value most highly keeping their slots, there'd be $29 worth of surplus available, and that's 8 more than when we do first come, first served. $8 more. So first come, first served is inefficient. It's bad. We can do better for everybody. What's a way to do better? Why don't we do something like the auction method that was imposed on the airlines and which proved out to be a much better way of resolving the allocation of scarce slots than the first come, first served method there. Quincy.
Does the reservation price compared to someone who's like 5 versus 6, could that force Earl to maybe pay 7 and then change the allocation?
If we do first come, first served, these numbers don't figure in the allocation. These are the ones who get served because they got there first. If we said, now we want volunteers to give up their slots, let's do an auction. I'll give you $1 if you give up your slots. Who's going to volunteer? These numbers are the reservation prices for stepping forward. Nobody's volunteered. I offered $1. So I offer $2. How many volunteer then? Still no one. $3, still no. $4, finally I get a volunteer. I need 2 volunteers, so I got to keep upping it. If I can't discriminate among the volunteers, I've got to keep upping it till I get the requisite number of volunteers, and that means I got to go to 5. So I bid 5 for volunteers, I get 2 volunteers. Earl steps forward, Carrie steps forward. Carrie is the only one who is really going to be treated differently here. Earl wasn't going to get served no matter what. He wasn't willing to pay enough to be among the top 3 in terms of surplus, and he got there last. So what's the effect on surplus? We've gained $8 in surplus from the 3 who get to keep their slots. $8 in surplus, $29 versus $21. The surplus for the 2 who volunteer, what's that? Well, they don't get the surplus that they would have gotten from keeping their slots if they'd kept them. Only Carrie would have gotten to keep hers under first come first. But they get $5, which is at least as good as that for one of them, and $1 better than that for another one. So Carrie and Earl, who volunteer, they get $10 in total worth of economic surplus from the payment made by the salon owner. The salon owner, what's the effect of the payments on him? He's $10 down making those payments. So the extra surplus from the volunteers, the $10 they get, is exactly offset by the loss in surplus from making these compensation payments by the salon owner. So that's a wash. What's the net change in surplus? $8 to the good. Is anyone worse off? None of the customers are worse off. It looks like the salon owner's worse off, so why would he do this? And there you have to dig a little deeper, and we didn't do this on the airline example, but the salon owner has an interest in not turning away people involuntarily too. If there were 2 salons and one of them occasionally told you, sorry, we can't help you, you have an appointment, yeah, I know, but tough. And the other one said, we will keep your appointment every time, or solicit volunteers as necessary in order to honor that pledge. You're going to go to the one that never bumps you, and you're going to be willing to pay a little bit more for that. And if this happens only infrequently, the salon owner is going to gain a benefit more than enough to cover the $10 occasional volunteer payment he has to offer. It's the same with the airlines. Question?
Sorry, I might have missed this, but why is the surplus to the customers $10 and not $10 minus the reservation?
You get, if you keep your slot, you get $4 worth of surplus if you're Carrie. She didn't keep her slot. So she didn't get that $4. What did she get? She got $5. Earl wouldn't have kept his slot, so wouldn't have gotten the $5 he would have been willing to pay to keep it, but he did get $5 for volunteering to relinquish his slot. So everybody here is going to come out a winner if we do this, and when we don't use the price mechanism to allocate these scarce slots, we create a situation where the economic surplus is smaller than it needs to be. Why would you want to do that? Let me talk to you about the incidence of a tax. You will often hear people talk about slapping taxes on parties that have more money than they need, so we don't want to disadvantage consumers by taxing them. Let's tax the rich businesses because they've got deep pockets and can pay the tax without suffering much harm in the process. All right, let's follow that through and do an analysis of who pays a tax imposed on a business. So I'm going to think of a per unit of output tax levied on the seller. Here is the supply curve in the market. That's the horizontal sum of all the marginal cost curves. Here's the demand curve. That's the horizontal sum of all the demand curves of people in the market. The equilibrium price will be $6 a pound. There will be 12 million pounds a month of whatever is being sold in this market. And we're going to collect now a tax of $6 on every unit sold by each supplier. What's the way to think about the effect of that tax in this diagram? What does it change? What's the supply curve tell us? The cost of producing each unit of output at the margin. Dana. The supply, I find it more intuitive to say it'll shift up. You could say, yes, it's the same as shifting left. But the amount by which it shifts is an upward movement of exactly $6 at every unit. Why? Because in addition to whatever private costs the seller incurs making the product, now it's got to pay $6 in tax for every unit it makes and sells. So yeah, I think in this case, an upward movement of $6 is the most instructive way to think about the effect of this tax in this diagram. Everyone okay with that? So we're going to tax the business because they can afford it. There's the new supply curve. There's going to be a new equilibrium here. What's the price going to be? $10. What's the supplier going to get from selling each unit in that equilibrium? The supplier is going to get to keep 4 out of each $10 it collects from the cash register. 6 of it pays to the government as tax. It keeps 4. Okay? What about the consumer? How much is the consumer going to pay for the product? 10. So let's compare the amounts that seller and buyer end up getting with what was the original allocation. They were each, the buyer was paying 6, the seller was getting 6. The buyer is now paying 10. That's $4 more than he was paying before. The seller is getting 4. That's $2 less than he was getting in the original situation. So if we want to say, where does this tax fall? Who pays it? The answer is 2/3 of it are paid by the buyers, and only 1/3 of it is paid by the sellers. So we taxed the sellers, and the actual incidence of the tax fell way more than half on the buyers. That's interesting. Let's investigate what would happen if we imposed the tax instead on the buyer, not on the seller. What would we think about the effect of a tax imposed on the buyer in terms of a shift in the original supply-demand diagram? Well, think about the demand curve at any point. Let's look at 8 million units. The buyers were willing to pay a price of 10 when they were buying 8 million units. Now they know they have to pay a tax of 6 on that. So what they're willing to pay for the actual good itself is going to be 4 because they know they're going to be hit with an additional 6 of tax. So the demand curve in terms of what the seller sees is not the original demand curve. It's that curve shifted downward by exactly $6 a unit. Does that seem like a sensible way to interpret the effect of this tax change? Yes.
When you say price by pound, is it referred to after tax? Or in the price by pound?
The price here is the price inclusive of the tax. This is the price without the tax. And so the new demand curve, the one that's shifted down by 6, hits the original supply curve. At this point, they're at the $4 a pound, 8 million pounds a month point. So the buyer is paying 4 to the seller. That's what the seller's getting from the buyer. And the buyer is then paying 6 to the government above that amount. How does that compare with the original amounts? The buyer used to pay 6, now he's paying 10, so he's paying 4 more than before. The seller used to get 6, now she's getting 4. She's getting 2 less than before. Exactly the same effect as when we impose that tax on the seller. Exactly the same effect. No difference, not to the penny. So if you say, we're going to tax businesses because they can afford to pay the tax, we're not going to burden poor consumers with the tax, that's complete blowing smoke. The tax falls where it can, not where you put it. It falls, whoever can avoid it, avoids it by shifting to other things. That's all about the slopes of the demand curve. And if we look at the most empirically relevant case in competitive models, that's the case of the constant cost industry. In the long run, you can produce as many units as you want to without having an increase in your unit costs. In industries like that, the supply curves are flat. How is a tax imposed on the seller distributed across sellers and buyers? In that case, well, if you look at the effect of shifting the supply curve up by $1, the effect of that is to raise the price by exactly $1 that the buyer pays. The seller gets the exact same amount as before. If he got less than that, he'd go out of business. He wouldn't cover his costs. And so 100% of a tax in this empirically most relevant case, if you impose it on the seller, the buyer pays every nickel of it. So don't be fooled by statements about who's going to pay a tax based on where the tax is collected. It really depends on both sides of the market and what the relevant supply and demand curves look like. And in general, sellers and buyers will pay some share of the tax. And if it's ever one side only, it will be, in this case, where the supply curve is horizontal, the buyer is going to pay 100% of the tax in that case. The tax falls where it can, not where it's placed. Okay, question.
So I'm assuming that this thing is valid only when we talk about taxes on goods and services. If you tax profits, that will be, that seller will have to pay.
The question is, what happens if you tax goods and services? We get an effect like I've analyzed here. If instead we tax profit, how will the answer be different? Great question, and it's one I'm going to consider when we talk about price setters as opposed to price takers. If we tax profit in the case of price takers, we'll put firms out of business because they're covering only the opportunity cost of their capital. If we try to take any of that money away from them, they won't be able to cover the cost of their capital and they'll have to fold. Benjamin.
Going off of that, it seems to me that the bulk of taxes on goods and services are generally to incent behavior rather than specifically to raise money. So I'm thinking of soda can recycling, ball deposits, cigarette tax, tariffs are usually protectionism on goods made domestically.
So you say most taxes are not for the purpose of raising revenue, they're for guiding people's behavior. I would say some taxes are clearly of the form you describe. I would go further and say all taxes should be of that form, but all taxes are not of that form. The general sales tax is not of that form. It's just a percentage of everything you buy. Whether the thing you buy causes harm or not is not at issue in the general sales tax that's levied. Later on, I will, as time permits, I will try to make the point that if we confined our tax system to only those activities that cause undue harm to others, we could raise more than enough revenue to do everything any reasonable society would want to do in the public sphere. If we taxed only pollution, if we taxed only congestion, only other specific activities, noise, activities that cause harm to others, we could raise way more revenue than we need. A CO2 tax would raise, of the level that corresponds to the harm that CO2 emissions apparently are causing, we could raise an enormous amount of revenue. And the revenue we would raise from a tax like that would mean we wouldn't need to have sales taxes on things that aren't causing harm to others, or income taxes on people who, by virtue of the incomes they earn, aren't causing harm to others. Follow up.
Maybe you'll cover this later, but would you consider societal inequality to be one of those externalities that needs to be practically taxed?
In a word, there will be a very clear case for taxing consumption beyond a certain level. How much does a family need to spend on its daughter's wedding? It needs to spend enough so that the guests will go home feeling like you recognize that it was an important occasion. Well, that's not a fixed amount. People today spend, on average in America, $31,000 on their daughter's wedding. In Manhattan, the average for 2 years ago was $76,000 for a wedding. That's the average. There are many weddings that are well into the millions. Nobody thinks that the people who are getting married today are happier because they're spending 3 times as much as they were spending in 1980. It was 1980 figure was $11,000 in inflation-adjusted dollars. Things have escalated and that has shifted the frame of reference that defines what people feel they need to spend on their daughter's wedding in order to feel like they have staged a suitable celebration for that occasion. But there's no gain from that. And so if there were any practical way to discourage people from spending as much as they're spending, that would be pure windfall gain to them and others. So we'll talk about that, but that's not for today. I understand by making that remark, I have unleashed a torrent of thoughts and feelings that long to be expressed, but I won't be able to describe the 2 sample midterm questions I had hoped to tell you about if I take many more questions about that. But since that's not the topic for today anyway, I'm going to press on. So with apologies to those of you who aren't going to get. So here's a sample midterm question. We've got Phil, who's considering 2 insurance policies. One covers major medical expenses. The other, that's policy A, the other covers major medical expenses and, I think it's policy A that covers major medical expenses and visits to the clinic for minor medical problems. Phil has a zit. He's got a prom coming up. He wants to get advice what to do. He goes to the clinic. If he hadn't been able to go to the clinic, he wouldn't have died. He would have asked a friend what to do about his zit. He would have bought some topical ointment somewhere and put it on. But he could have gone to the clinic and gotten professional treatment for his zit. That would have been a cost. And he would decide accordingly what to do about his zit. If he has to pay to go to the clinic, maybe he would go. If it's an important enough occasion, maybe he wouldn't go. If he can go to the clinic for free, probably he would go. That's the spirit of the issues underlying the discussion in this example. So that's his demand curve for visits to the clinic. These are just minor medical complaints he has. Shall I go see the doctor about it? That's his question. So the marginal cost of providing a clinic visit, I'm just assuming to be $10. That's what the clinic charges him when he goes there. He could buy policy A that covers the cost of the clinic visit, or policy B where he has to pay that cost himself. The policies are sold in the competitive market, and that means that the insurers can charge only enough to cover the costs of providing his coverage. Which policy will he buy, and how much additional economic surplus will he expect to get if he buys the better of the two options? That's a midterm question. It has been in the past. I'm going to say that that question is easy difficult because of the proportion of people who get it wrong. It's, to my eye, an alarmingly high proportion. It's not a difficult question if you've thought through the issues at stake. It's an efficiency question. What's the requirement for efficiency? Price should be equal to marginal cost. He's got two policies he's considering. One provides clinic visits for free. The other, he has to buy clinic visits out of his own pocket. Which one is going to encourage efficient use of the services provided by the clinic? Again, we're talking about minor medical complaints. Jacob?
The one with $10.
Yeah, if he can go for free, then he's not got any incentive to economize on the use of that service. There's a story told of a group of women in Japan where every medical expense is covered, no matter how trivial, no cost sharing of any kind. A group of women became accustomed, they would go to the clinic every day to get checked out. One day, Mrs. Yamamura didn't go. And one of the other women in the group said, "Where's Mrs. Yamamura today?" And her neighbor, who's also in the group, "She couldn't come today. She's sick." It was just, it was free, so it was a convenient occasion to gather. And so while we're waiting to get checked out, we'll talk about stuff going on out there in the hood. It's in the spirit of trying to encourage people to take into account the costs of the resources they're asking other people to provide that this question is focused on the differences between these two policies. One of them, he gets it for free at the margin. He's got to pay for it because they can't sell him a policy where they're paying for his visits unless they collect from him enough to cover the expected cost of that. So which policy will he choose, and how much more surplus will he get from the better of the two policies? You got 5 choices on the midterm. If you don't know anything, you got 1/5 chance to get this right. Wouldn't you rather be certain to get it right? Work a few of these problems. Think about the implications of the question and feel comfortable with it. Everybody can get to that position. There's no special mental faculty that you need to be able to get completely in control of a question like this. It's just, you practice a little bit and you think about it. But if you just say, that sounds easy, I'm not going to bother, you're liable to get this question wrong. You say, oh, what was I thinking not to have worked on that? So what do we know? If he gets the policy that provides coverage for the $10 visits, he doesn't have to pay, how many visits is he going to make? No, not 30. 40. They're free to him. The marginal charge to him for a visit is 0. How many is he going to demand? The demand curve is what tells you the answer to that question. He's going to demand 40 visits if he takes that policy. How many visits will he demand if he has to pay for them out of his own pocket? 30. What can we say about the 10 extra visits? We can say that they weren't worth it to him to have used those visits. They cost society $10 each to provide. He valued each and every one of them at less than $10. The amount on the demand curve tells you how much he valued them. And so that's wasted surplus. How much extra is policy A going to have to charge? Remember, that's the policy that pays for your clinic visits. The annual premium for policy A, they provide identical coverage for all major medical expenses. The only difference is policy A covers his clinic visits, policy B doesn't cover them. How much extra will the premium be for policy A? There's one number that answers that question. Who knows what that number is? The way you would think about it is to say, how many visits will he take? 40. What's the bill from the clinic to the insurance company going to be for those visits? $400. How many visits will the other policy pay for? No. It will pay for 0 visits. It doesn't cover those visits. So how much extra will the policy premium have to be for the policy A that covers the visits? $400 extra he's got to pay. The information's sitting there. It's ready to be harvested. It's low-hanging fruit. Pick it. So he's got to pay $400 extra. Okay, that's the downside. What's the upside of that policy? He gets free clinic visits. And so his consumer surplus from clinic visits is that trapezoid bigger than his consumer surplus from the visits that he has to pay for himself. And the cost of the visits is the rectangle. The benefit of free visits is the extra surplus he gets. And the rectangle is bigger than the trapezoid by 10 visits per semester times $10 per visit times 1/2. That's the area of that triangle. That's the difference between the area of the rectangle and the area of the trapezoid. Or you don't have to talk about the difference between the area of the rectangle and the area of the trapezoid. You can just say, here's the wasted surplus. It's that area there, that little triangle. You can all do this. One more. There's a guy, he gets massages in the market. He pays $20 per massage. Here's his demand curve. It's P equals 60 minus Q, where P is the price per massage and Q is the number of massages he buys per year. And if we graph it, it looks like that. Now he marries Susan, from whom he had been buying massages in the market up until then. Okay? Now he feels that he should get massages from Susan for free. I'm supposed to pay her now for Susan, for massages? What, are you kidding me? He says, what's the effect of this new arrangement on the family's total economic surplus? It's a question you can answer. What's the matter with this arrangement? The massages are scarce. For everyone she gives Terry, she could have given one more out there in the market. And we assumed in the question that he doesn't care who he gets a massage from. She doesn't care who she gives a massage to. It's just all worth whatever they reckoned the value of it before this. And so what's going to happen now? We're going to lose some economic surplus under this arrangement. Look at the demand curve. Before he got married, he was buying 40 massages a year. What's he going to want now? He's going to want 60. Every one of those extra 20 massages is not cost justified. It's worth 20 if she would take the same time and effort and go give it to somebody else. She's not getting paid anything for it, but he's getting something. But what he's getting is what he would have been willing to pay for, and that's less than 20. This is a bad deal for the family. They lose surplus equal to the area of that triangle. And it ought to be possible for him to make them to reach a deal that's better for both of them than this deal. If you can't figure out a whole bunch of examples of deals that are better for both of them, then you don't get the point of that example. Efficiency is good. You got to be efficient. Being efficient doesn't mean that you've done everything you needed to do, but if you haven't been efficient, you haven't done everything you needed to do. Okay,